mean I'll see it.
My family has held onto that patch of dirt in Cornwall for over 4 centuries. It is a stubborn, grey piece of land where the wind constantly bites at the limestone and the salt from the sea makes everything rust faster than it should. Growing up, the farm felt like a living thing, something we didn't just live on, but served. Every generation, without fail, the eldest son had to trek out to the edge of the property where the woods get thick and the air feels stagnant. There stands the hollow oak. It is a skeletal, twisted thing, stunted by age and looking more like a claw reaching out of the earth than a tree. On the night of the winter solstice, the ritual was always the same, a bowl of fresh cream and a single drop of blood. My father used to laugh it off when I reached my teens, calling it a silly tradition to keep the soil fertile, a bit of folklore that kept the old folks happy. When my father passed away late last autumn, the weight of the farm fell entirely on my shoulders. I was exhausted, grieving, and frankly, I didn't have time for superstitions. The winter solstice came during a particularly brutal cold snap, and the thought of trudging through knee-deep sludge to bleed into a bowl felt ridiculous. I stayed inside by the fire, holding my newborn son and watching the frost patterns crawl across the window pane. I skipped it. I told myself that the land didn't care about a drop of blood. I thought the silence of the night was just the winter settle, but looking back, it was the sound of a contract being held in suspension. The change didn't happen all at once. It started when the spring thaw finally hit. Normally, the first sprouts are a vibrant, hopeful green, but this year, the earth seemed to vomit up something different. The wheat didn't just fail to grow, it emerged from the dirt like charred bone. The stalks were oily and black, slick to the touch, and they didn't sway in the wind. They stood rigid, clicking against one another like dry teeth. But it was the scent that really got to me. It didn't smell like wet earth or rain. It smelled like a butcher's shop that had lost power in the height of summer. It was the thick, cloying stench of rotted meat and fermented bile that seemed to rise from the very pores of the soil. I spent weeks trying to plow it under, but the machinery would snag on roots that shouldn't have been there. I found myself constantly looking toward the woods, feeling a prickle on the back of my neck, as if the trees were leaning in to listen to my frustrations. The air around the house started to feel crowded. It was a dense, suffocating presence that made it difficult to draw a full breath, like the atmosphere had been replaced by something much more substantial than oxygen. My wife complained of headaches, saying she felt like the walls were pressing inward, but I told her it was just the stress of a bad season. I was lying to both of us. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night that felt unnervingly still. I woke up around 3 a.m., not because of a noise, but because of the cold. It wasn't the kind of chill you get from an open window. It was a localized, piercing frost that seemed to radiate from the center of the room. I reached for the lamp, but my arm felt like it was moving through molasses. That was when I saw them. There were 4 of them, standing in a semicircle at the foot of our bed. They were tall, unnaturally thin, and dressed in tattered, salt-stained clothing from the 1600s. The fabric was stiff with age and filth, hanging off their frames like funeral shrouds. But it was their heads that froze the air in my lungs. They didn't have faces. Where eyes and mouths should have been, there were only smooth, seamless masks carved from dark oak. The grain of the wood was intricate, swirling in patterns that seemed to pulse and shift if I looked at them too long. They didn't move. They didn't breathe. They just stood there, radiating an ancient, cold malice that made my skin crawl. I tried to shout, to lunge at them, but my body wouldn't obey. My voice was trapped in my throat, vibrating against my teeth. That's when the voice started. It wasn't a sound, it was a physical intrusion into my skull, like a rusted needle scraping against the inside of my forehead. It told me that the soil remembers the contract. It told me that if I would not give the drop, they would take the vein. The words felt oily and sharp, leaving a lingering bitterness in the back of my mouth that tasted like old coins and stagnant water. I watched, paralyzed, as the tallest figure leaned over the crib where my firstborn son was sleeping. Its wooden fingers were long and jagged, resembling splintered branches more than human digits. I blacked out from the sheer, overwhelming terror of it. When I finally jolted awake at dawn, the room was flooded with the pale, sickly light of a gray morning. My wife was still fast asleep, her breathing deep and rhythmic, blissfully unaware of the nightmare. I scrambled toward the crib, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it was painful. The crib was empty. There was no sign of a struggle, no discarded blankets. In the spot where my son had been laying just hours before, there was a bundle of dry, brittle sticks tied together with a strand of coarse, black hair. Tucked into the center of the bundle was a single, oversized acorn. It was a deep, bruised purple color and felt unnervingly warm to the touch. I didn't call the police. What would I even say? I ran out to the fields, screaming his name until my throat felt like it was lined with glass. I reached the edge of the woods and stopped dead. The path to the hollow oak wasn't covered in mud anymore. It was lined with fresh, white organs. Long strings of intestines were draped over the low-hanging branches like festive garlands, still glistening with a slick, translucent film. The ground was saturated, turning the dirt into a dark, crimson mire that clung to my boots. The air was so thick with the scent of an open chest cavity that I had to gag, the metallic tang of it coating my tongue. I reached the tree, and my legs gave out. The hollow oak wasn't skeletal anymore. It was pulsing. The bark was wet and stretched tight, looking more like translucent skin than wood. Beneath the surface, I could see things moving, dark, rhythmic thumps that looked like a heartbeat traveling through the trunk. At the base of the tree, where the roots delved deep into the ancient earth, the bowl I had neglected to fill sat waiting. It wasn't empty. It was overflowing with a thick, dark crimson fluid that was far too much to have come from a single person. I looked up at the branches and saw small, pink shapes beginning to bud from the wood. They looked like tiny, unformed hands, the fingers translucent and twitching in the cold breeze. I realized then that the contract wasn't just about fertility or crops. It was a trade. The land provides, but the land is hungry, and it has been eating my family for 400 years. I hadn't just skipped a chore, I had defaulted on a debt that was centuries overdue. I went back to the house and found my wife sitting on the floor, cradling the bundle of sticks and singing a lullaby I didn't recognize. Her eyes were vacant, the pupils blown wide until they were just black voids. She didn't look at me when I entered. She just kept rocking that pile of wood, her fingernails digging into the dry bark until her fingertips bled, the red soaking into the sticks. I've tried to leave. I packed a bag, put her in the car, and drove for 3 hours. But no matter which road I took, no matter how many turns I made, I always ended up back at the gate of the farm. The engine would die, the lights would flicker out, and there would be those 4 figures standing in the middle of the road with their wooden masks, waiting for me to come home. The black wheat is nearly waist high now. It's starting to grow toward the house, the oily stalk scraping against the siding at night with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. I can hear the heartbeat from the woods even through the closed windows. It's louder today. I think the tree is getting ready to bloom, and I know, with a sickening certainty, that when those buds open, I'm going to see my son's eyes looking back at me from the bark. The soil doesn't just remember the contract. It's currently digesting it.
Next story.
I'm sitting in the kitchen right now with the back door locked and a kitchen knife sitting on the table next to my laptop. I keep looking at the baby monitor, but the screen is just dark static and I can't bring myself to go back down the hallway to check the room. People always talk about that maternal instinct, that gut feeling that tells you when your child is in danger, but nobody ever mentions what happens when that instinct tells you that your child is the danger. It started about a week ago. My son, Leo, is 6 months old. He was always a fussy sleeper, the kind of baby who would scream the house down if a floorboard creaked, but suddenly he just stopped. No crying, no whimpering, nothing. I woke up at 3 in the morning because the silence was so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I went into the nursery, expecting to find him breathless or something horrible, but he was just sitting there. He wasn't lying down like a normal infant who can barely support his own head. He was sitting bolt upright in the corner of the crib, staring at the door. When I turned on the night light, his eyes didn't squint or blink. They were wide, reflecting the dim yellow glow in a way that looked almost glass-like, or like the eyes of a cat caught in headlights. He wouldn't take his bottle. I tried everything. Formula, breast milk, even mashed fruit. He would just keep his lips pressed tight together, watching my throat move as I talked to him. The only time he showed any interest in food was when I was defrosting some sirloin for dinner. I had the raw meat on the counter and I was holding him on my hip. He lunged. I don't mean he reached for it, he threw his entire body weight forward with a strength that nearly snapped my wrist. His small, toothless gums clamped down on the edge of the raw steak, and he tore a strip of it away with a jagged, frantic pulling motion. I had to pry his jaws open to get it out, and the inside of his mouth felt cold. Not just chilly, but like reaching into a bowl of ice water. The air in the house started to change after that. It didn't just smell stale, it started to carry this thick, cloying scent of wet earth and something metallic, like a handful of rusted nails soaked in stagnant water. It was the smell of a basement that had been flooded for years. I cleaned every inch of that nursery, scrubbing the baseboards until my fingers bled, but the stench just seemed to seep out of the walls themselves. My neighbor, Mrs. Gable, stopped by yesterday. She's one of those old-world women who grew up in the countryside and still believes in things most people laugh at. She took one look at Leo sitting in his playpen and she turned pale, her skin turning the color of curdled milk. She didn't even step inside. She just leaned in and whispered that I needed to make eggshell tea over a fire of rowan wood. She told me that if what was in that playpen wasn't my son, the steam would force its hand. I thought she was losing her mind, but after she left, I looked at Leo. He was staring at the spot where she had been standing, and he peeled back his lips in a way that looked less like a smile and more like a predator displaying its anatomy. I was desperate. The lack of sleep was making my vision blur and my head throb with a dull, constant pressure. I found some rowan wood in the brush at the edge of the woods behind our fence and cleared out the fireplace. I saved the shells from breakfast and put them in a pot of water, setting it right over the flickering orange flames. The room grew hot, the heat shimmering in waves, making the shadows on the walls stretch and distort. I carried Leo into the living room. He felt different in my arms. His skin felt like it was sliding over something hard and knotted, like a bag filled with wet stones. He didn't squirm. He didn't make a sound. I held him near the hearth, letting the thick, white steam from the boiling eggshells billow up around us. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the child in my arms began to change. It didn't grow or shrink, but it seemed to tighten. The soft, pudgy features of my baby's face began to sharpen into something angular and ancient. His eyes, which were supposed to be a soft blue, turned a muddy, bruised purple. He didn't cry when the heat hit him. Instead, he simply pushed himself out of my grip. He stood up. A 6-month-old infant stood on his own 2 feet on the hearthstone, his spine straight and rigid. He looked up at me, and his face was a mask of pure, calculated malice. When he spoke, it wasn't a human voice. It sounded like 2 massive boulders being ground together in the dark, a dry, grating noise that made my teeth ache. "I've seen the first acorn fall from the first tree," the thing said, its voice vibrating in the floorboards beneath my feet. "And in all those centuries, I have never seen a mother so utterly foolish." The sound that came out of him next wasn't a scream, it was a high-pitched, vibrating trill that felt like a needle being driven into my eardrums. He turned and scrambled toward the fireplace. He didn't crawl. He moved with the blurring, frantic speed of a centipede, his limbs bending at angles that would have snapped human bone. He vanished up the chimney, the soot falling down in a black cloud as he scratched his way up into the night. I didn't think. I just ran. I sprinted out the back door, screaming my son's name into the dark. I ran toward the woods, my feet catching on roots and brambles that tore at my ankles. I followed a sound, a soft, rhythmic bubbling noise. I reached the old garden plot at the back of the property, a place that had been overgrown for decades. In the center of the clearing, the moonlight hit the dirt. I saw a small, pale shape sticking out of the ground. It was Leo. He was buried up to his neck in the freezing, damp soil, his little face turned up toward the moon. He wasn't crying. He was laughing. It was a hollow, breathless sound that didn't have any joy in it. I dug him out with my bare hands, my fingernails tearing as I clawed through the dirt and rocks. He was freezing, his skin the color of a drowned man, but he was breathing. I carried him back to the house, locking every door and window, barricading us in the kitchen. That was 4 hours ago. He's sitting on the floor now, playing with a wooden block. He hasn't said a word. He hasn't cried once since I brought him back inside. He just sits there in the center of the room, staring at the dark hallway that leads to the nursery. But something is wrong. The light from the kitchen stove is casting a long, flickering shadow behind him on the linoleum. My son is sitting perfectly still, his small round head tilted to the side. But his shadow, the shadow isn't mimicking him. The shadow on the floor has long, pointed ears that twitch with every sound from the woods outside. It has a thin, whip-like tail that lashes back and forth against the cabinets. And as I watch, the shadow's hand reaches out, its fingers long and clawed, and it mimes the action of reaching for my throat. I can hear something scratching on the roof now. It's not the sound of branches. It's the sound of something with long, hard nails trying to find a way back down the chimney. I'm looking at my son, and I'm looking at the knife, and I realize that when I dug him out of that garden, the dirt wasn't fresh. It was packed hard, as if he'd been under there for a long, long time. The thing on the floor just looked up at me. It didn't smile, but it tapped its fingers on the tile in a rhythmic, deliberate pattern. The smell of wet earth is getting stronger. I don't think I brought the right one back. I think the one in the crib was just a distraction, and the one I dug out of the ground is something much, much worse. The scratching on the roof has stopped. Now, there's just a soft, wet thud against the kitchen window, like a piece of raw meat being slapped against the glass. I'm too afraid to turn around and look.
Next story.
I never really believed in the old stories, the kind of things the locals in rural Ireland whisper about over a pint when they think no one is listening. To me, it was just folklore, a way to keep the tourists interested and the kids from wandering too far into the bogs. So, when I bought that patch of land on the edge of the bun, I didn't think twice about the jagged standing stone sitting right in the middle of the field where I wanted to put my workshop. It was a gnarled, gray slab of limestone, leaning at an awkward angle and covered in lichen that looked like dried scabs. The neighbors were polite enough, but they were insistent. An old man from the farm down the road, a guy who looked like he was carved out of the same limestone as the stone itself, stopped his truck by my gate the first week. He told me that stone was a marker for a fairy path, a boundary that shouldn't be crossed or disturbed. He called it a nail. I just nodded and smiled, thinking about how much easier it would be to level the ground once that eyesore was gone. I'm a practical person. I had a tractor, a chain, and a deadline. The day I moved, it was unusually cold. The sky was that flat, oppressive gray that feels like it's pressing down on your shoulders. It took 3 tries to get a good grip with the chains. When the stone finally gave way, it didn't just slide out, it made a sound like a wet bone snapping deep underground. A foul, stagnant air seemed to puff out of the hole, smelling like a cellar that hadn't been opened in 100 years, earthy, damp, and thick with the scent of something that had gone soft and rotten. I hauled it to the edge of the woods and dumped it, feeling a weird sense of satisfaction. I thought I had reclaimed my land. The sun went down early that evening, and a strange, suffocating stillness settled over the house. I was in the kitchen making dinner when I noticed the floor felt off. It wasn't just uneven, it felt tilted, as if the entire house was slowly sliding down a steep hill. I put a glass of water on the counter and watched as it slid toward the edge, eventually shattering on the floor. I figured the foundation was settling, maybe from the vibration of the tractor earlier. But then I looked out the window. The sun had set, but the sky wasn't black. It was a bruised, sickly purple, the color of a fresh hematoma. And the grass, my field, which had been green and vibrant only hours before, was now a ghostly, translucent white. It looked like thousands of thin, pale hairs growing out of the dark earth. I felt a sudden, massive pressure in my chest, an overwhelming sense of dread that made my lungs feel constricted and tight. I went to the back door to get a better look, thinking my mind was playing tricks on me. I turned the handle and stepped out, expecting the gravel of my driveway. Instead, I stepped directly back into the field. I turned around, confused, and looked at the door I had just come through. It was standing alone in the middle of the white grass, no house attached to it. Just a door frame in the middle of a void. Panic started to set in, a cold, sharp blade of ice cutting through my stomach. I ran back through the door, hoping to find my kitchen, but I ended up back in the same field. No matter which way I turned, no matter which door I opened or window I climbed through, I was always standing in that white grass under that necrotic purple sky. The house was gone. The road was gone. There was only the field and the stone. And the stone was back in the center. It wasn't leaning anymore. It was standing perfectly straight, but it looked different. It looked wet. I walked toward it, my boots crunching on the white grass, which felt less like vegetation and more like brittle, tiny bones breaking under my weight. As I got closer, I saw movement. At first, I thought they were rocks or mounds of dirt. But then they moved. There were hundreds of them. Small, stunted figures, barely 3 feet tall, crouched around the stone. They didn't have skin, at least, not like ours. They looked like they were molded out of wet, gray mud and packed tight with rows of needle-sharp human teeth. They didn't have eyes, just dark, weeping holes where eyes should have been. They were busy. They were remeasuring the land. I stopped a few yards away, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. 2 of them were holding a long, glistening cord, stretching it tight between them to mark a new line in the white grass. My stomach turned when I realized what the cord was. It wasn't rope. It was a length of human intestines, still glistening with a slick, yellowish film. The smell hit me then, not the metallic scent people usually describe, but something much worse. It was the sickly sweet, cloying stench of a butcher's been left out in the summer heat, mixed with the sour tang of stomach acid. It was visceral and thick, coating the back of my throat until I wanted to gag. The creatures were chattering, but it wasn't a language. It was a wet, clicking sound, like stones being rubbed together underwater. They ignored me at first, focusing on their grisly task. They were hammering small stakes into the ground, stakes made of finger bones, using the intestines to map out a new geography. I realized then what the old man had meant by a nail. That standing stone wasn't just a decoration, it was what held my version of reality to the physical earth. By pulling it up, I had unfastened the map. I had let the corners of my world curl up and blow away, and now I was drifting into theirs. This wasn't my field anymore. I was a trespasser in a place that didn't follow the rules of light or physics. One of the creatures, its body dripping with that gray, primordial sludge, turned toward me. It didn't have a nose, just a jagged slit above a mouth overflowing with those misplaced teeth. It held up a section of the red, wet cord and beckoned me. It wanted me to help. It wanted to measure me. I bolted. I ran toward where I thought the stone had been dumped, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The air felt thick, like I was running through waist-deep water. Every time I looked back, the creatures were closer, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait, their mud-slicked limbs snapping and popping with every step. They weren't running, they were rippling across the white grass. I found the stone near the edge of the dark woods. It looked smaller now, diminished. I fell to my knees and grabbed the edge of it. It was ice cold, so cold it felt like it was burning the skin off my palms. I tried to lift it, but it felt like it weighed thousands of pounds. It was anchored to nothing, yet it refused to move. I heard the wet, clicking sounds right behind me. I didn't look back. I knew they were there, their toothy mouths hanging open, their eyeless sockets fixed on the back of my neck. I began to scream. I wasn't screaming for help. There was no one to hear me. I was screaming apologies. I sobbed into the freezing stone, begging it to go back, promising I would never touch it again, that I would leave the land to them, that I would be a silent neighbor. The creatures didn't attack. They just watched. I could hear their wet, rhythmic breathing, a sound like air being forced through a saturated sponge. I felt a cold, slick hand, if you could call it that, touch the small of my back. It felt like a clump of wet clay, but with the distinct, hard pressure of several small teeth pressing into my flesh. With a burst of adrenaline fueled by a pure, unadulterated terror, I heaved. I felt a muscle in my back tear, a hot, searing pain that made my vision go white, but the stone moved. I dragged it. I didn't have the tractor, I didn't have the chains. I dragged that massive slab of limestone across the white grass, inch by agonizing inch. The creatures followed, laughing. It wasn't a vocal laugh, it was a rhythmic snapping of their many teeth, a dry, clattering sound that echoed in the empty purple sky. By the time I reached the hole, my fingernails were gone, replaced by raw, bleeding nerves. My clothes were soaked in a mixture of my own sweat and the gray slime from the field. I rolled the stone into the depression. The moment the base of the stone hit the bottom of the hole, the world snapped. The purple sky vanished instantly, replaced by the familiar, pitch-black Irish night. The white grass was gone, replaced by the mud and gravel of my construction site. The smell of rot evaporated, leaving only the scent of damp earth and diesel from the tractor. I lay there in the mud for a long time, my heart slowly slowing down, my breath returning in ragged hitches. My back was screaming in pain, and my hands were a shredded mess of meat and dirt. I crawled back to the house, every movement a struggle against the lingering weight in my limbs. I didn't call the police. What would I say? I didn't go to the hospital until the next morning, claiming I'd had an accident with the tractor. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. I never built that shed. In fact, I never went back out to that field at all. I sold the land a month later to a developer, but I made sure to write a clause into the contract, a strange, legally binding requirement that the stone in the center of the field must never be moved, fenced off, or even touched. They thought I was a kook, just another eccentric who had spent too much time in the isolation of the West Coast. I moved to a small apartment in Dublin, as far away from the dirt and the grass as I could get. I stay on the 4th floor, where there is nothing but concrete and steel beneath me. But sometimes, when the sky turns a certain shade of purple at sunset, I feel the floor start to tilt. I look at my hands, at the faint, jagged scars where my fingernails never quite grew back right, and I wonder if the stone is still there. I wonder if the new owners listened. Because sometimes, when it's very quiet and the city noise dies down, I can still hear that dry, rhythmic clicking. And I can still feel the sensation of those wet, mud-caked teeth pressing softly against my spine, waiting for the nail to come loose again.
next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.